Just waiting for the attendees list to grow because we know there's about 65 people to join us. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Resilience Engineering Association webinar. In this particular case, it's the second of a pair that were planned last year that began initially out of an idea of considering COVID-19 and air traffic management within that environment, what happened last year. So the first webinar was very, very much about ATM in that context and COVID-19. What we wanted to do was then to take it further and to consider resilience engineering in the light of COVID-19 in cross domains. We have a panel of people here we'll be discussing this with. We'll introduce that shortly. Some housekeeping first of all, please. We would like you, the presentation has been recorded, so made available afterwards, along with the webinar report. To optimize audio and video quality and bandwidth, we would ask everybody other than the panelists to keep the video off. I believe it's set already like that. No audio, but please use the chat line if you have any questions. There's also a Q&A component to the Zoom window, and please put all of your questions in there. We've got people around who are monitoring that. So we do invite comments and questions, please. We've got some really interesting people on our panel, but also there's some very interesting people in the participants. So some people from Lund, but the likes of Dave Wood, who will be very helpful to us, I'm sure, in exploring some of these issues. And please do feel free to use the interactive chat between yourselves. We don't see that. One other thing I need to begin this session with is this term resilience. What do we mean by resilience? And we began the last session with exactly that. What does resilience mean? How could we get a common understanding of what that means? And the answer, of course, was, not surprisingly, no, we couldn't. There were a number of interesting perspectives that came out. One is about buffers, for example, in terms of the system. That was a key feature. Building resilience in terms of the system or organization, but there was a clear parallel with efficiency, effectiveness of the organization. But generally, the panelists last time, we had 4 panelists, one representing Eurocontrol, a pan-European body for ATM in Europe, one representing another body related to Eurocontrol, part of the European Commission, but from an air traffic controller who's running that part of the organization, an air traffic controller, somebody from the EASA, that is the regulator in Europe. We talk about ATM here very much in the European context. It's European ATM. So for those of you outside of Europe, I just need to give you that sort of guideline. Let me introduce the 3 panelists before we give the panel webinar to them to talk for 5 minutes or so. And we'll give them a chance to speak, ask some questions, and we'll explore some of the issues that emerge from the panel in November. I'd like to introduce first of all Nora Jones. Nora Jones is, talked earlier, had the delight of having in her title manager or head of chaos. Now, I just really like that, and I think it's fabulous to have that. Nora is passionate about safety. She works in the DevOps community, software engineering community, has worked with chaos engineering, resilience engineering, and particularly has found a way of using the classic safety ways of doing things for that community, which is quite different, innovative. And it's very exciting, the work that Nora's doing with her community. She has a company called Jelly, There are a number of software engineers who are in the audience here who are very much instrumental in this group emerging and doing things with resilience engineering in a slightly different way. So Dave Woods, Richard Cook, John Osborne with Snafu, that type of evolution of resilience perhaps. We have Dave Porvan from Australia. Dave is wonderful in that he has studied the safety professional, but he is a safety professional himself. Works with ForgeWorks, works with DATCA as a associate professor at Griffith University, finished his PhD, and I was listening to his podcast today, one of his podcasts about his last paper about resilience engineering in the safety professional. And there's one thing that really I love that he said that, okay, so Dave studied with Sydney studied with Dave Woods, who was an author of that paper, and somewhere Eric is in there as well. So I think there are 4 generations of academics within that scope. So Dave has worked in the construction industry, amongst others. So we have the delight of hearing possibly something about safety professionals, but also about resilience engineering in those other domains. Representing ATM is Alex Bristol. Alex Bristol is currently the CEO of Skyguide. Skyguide is the Swiss air navigation service provider, but Alex worked at NATS for a long time, starting life as a teacher, in fact. Alex is passionate about safety too. So we have 3 very passionate people about safety, and we're going to invite them now to talk for 5 minutes or so, beginning with Alex, to start with ATM, about some ideas about COVID-19 and ATM. Alex, over to you, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Smokes, and hello to everybody who's joined us. Looking back at 2020 and thinking about what has it meant in terms of resilience and what has COVID done to us, what lessons can we learn? I'd like to put a bit of context around that to start with. First of all, Skyguide is an air navigation service provider who is working hard and has been working hard for many years on the idea of being a high reliability organization, whose idea in itself revolves around a lot of the principles of resilience. It's a company as well that puts business continuity management and its crisis organization very high up. And indeed, we have 2 full-on exercises in a normal year for our crisis organization team as well. So we're quite well versed in how that works. We have an enterprise risk management system in addition to our safety management system. And the risk management also feeds into a strategy which we constructed starting in 2017, finished in 2019. So we have a really clear idea of where we want to go to and how we are going to put those stepping stones together to get there. Then COVID comes along, and we get to see how resilient we really are. And as Smokes actually alluded to earlier on the operational side and the technical side, we were pretty good. We could cope with what was thrown at us there. In some ways, of course, to a certain extent, it's easier because there's less traffic, there's less going on. So the high capacity, high risk elements don't exist. But some new risks then start emerging into the system through underload of the controllers and or different sets of geometries about all of the aircraft interactions. But on the ops and the tech side, I would say resilience was good and we did very well there. When I look, however, to see how we did on the financial side, I have to say that was, of course, a complete disaster. And it made us then realize that there was certain things that were missing for us in our thinking about resilience as well. So on the one hand, we were really proud of ourselves, for example, that we happened to have 10,000 masks, which we'd bought years ago when we were worried about SARS, which was still effective. So we could roll those out and keep the health of our controllers and our staff in the forefront. That was great. Then we focused secondarily on the operations itself, and then we focused on the finances. One of the decisions that we made very early on, which in hindsight was a very good one, was to set up a so-called task force for the COVID-related elements within the company at a level way below the executive team, which meant that the executive did not get sucked into trying to deal with everything that had to do with COVID, and allowed us then to work on the bigger picture, whilst the guys who actually knew much better what they were trying to do could then deal with the crisis on a daily and weekly basis. What we then discovered was that what we were missing was the concept of some kind of business resilience in some fashion, and that was really missing for us. It was clear very early on that the European business model, the model of how all of the European air traffic management works, was basically broken. It proved itself to have no resilience in itself whatsoever, and therefore it was brittle, if you like. On the air navigation service providers side, including Skyguide, not only did we see that the European business model was broken, but our own business models were simply not appropriate for this type of circumstance. And so, for example, we have fixed costs that are at a very, very high level. We're an infrastructure company, basically. But it also points towards one or two of the things that we need to change as we go forwards. If you have such high fixed costs, you're going to need to be bailed out by somebody if you need to continue to provide a service. And the states, world over, globally, all have a mandate to provide air traffic services over their land or over their territory. And so the states have this mandate to provide the infrastructure, and they give that job to the air navigation service provider. And the air navigation service providers are still stuck about 20, 30 years ago in technology. We're not virtualized yet. So therefore, we end up with a lot of infrastructure, little ability to buy in services, little ability to be resilient and to move the various services around. And that meant that in our case, for example, we had to be bailed out by the government. Okay, so in some sense, in the whole system, it still worked. But that was not the way we wanted to do it. In Skyguide's strategy, we had a look at our strategy, said, does it still work? Yes, it does, actually. Even under COVID, we've made some small adaptations, but said where we're trying to head to at the end, it's still the right thing to do. Virtualization is the right way to go. But now we've got to start working at getting business resilient and not just operationally and technically resilient. And that is going to be a big challenge for the years to come. Smokes, back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Nora, could we hear your perspective, please?
Sure. Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Nora. I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado today. So I am the CEO and founder of a company called Jelly.io. And we work in the software industry to help analyze incidents after they happen. And we do that by providing, looking at the transcript that people use to talk at incidents, about incidents, and allowing them to tag it and learn from it in a different way than software has previously looked at things. Resilience engineering is kind of a new concept to the software world right now. And in terms of how we're seeing COVID impact things in software in general, I mean, software has been more used than ever. I mean, we're all on Zoom today. Everyone went remote and online. And so I think the software industry kind of got a kick a little bit to be a little bit more buttoned up about our safety and our incidents and how we think about them and the perspective we think about them, because it became so much more critical than we had thought in a very, very short period of time. We're seeing, you know, just from working with a lot of the companies that we're working with now, we are seeing them wanting more buttoned up strategies around looking at how they deal with incidents in the moment and also how they look at them afterwards and how that feedback cycle kind of works. That is something that has been feeling quite new to a lot of folks in the software industry that have kind of traditionally taken more of a templated post-mortem approach after incidents. Yeah, I ran a learning from adaptations to coronavirus panel at a conference in the software industry called SRECon. And I think Fred Aber is here as a panelist, but he was on the panel as well. And we had folks from 3 different companies that had to rapidly scale during COVID-19. A company that delivered food to people and a company that streamed videos. And we also had someone in financial services, and all of those companies had weird kind of unexpected scale and adaptation that they had to deal with seemingly overnight. And they all had to come up with creative ways to make sure that they were staying up and able to serve the world in different ways. And so I think software has had kind of interesting view on all of this. And I think it's done quite well overall. We started our company back in August 2019, and so I feel like I've been running a business myself in the pandemic most of the time. Given the nature of our business and helping companies learn from incident, it's actually been quite helpful for us to have been fully remote the entire time. But I think we've seen a lot of software companies that are used to being co-located with each other in one space went online overnight. And I think what's going to happen that's going to be very interesting is when folks start to go back into the office and have that kind of mixture of folks being online and folks being in the office, that's going to be quite hard again, because we're used to one, we're used to the other, but we're not used to this joint mixture of both. So I think that's going to be interesting for software organizations to adapt to in ways that I don't think has been fully thought through yet when something like that is going to happen. But I think we're seeing folks in the software industry get used to, in certain ways, like the scale and stuff that's happened. Like, I think that initial shock factor is no longer there, but I think it has led us to viewing our services as a bit more critical than they were before.
Thank you very much indeed, Nora. Two interesting phrases you used. One about scalability, which was something that emerged in the first workshop. And there's also this notion of what are we going to come out of COVID-19 to? COVID-19 is not going to go away, but the fundamental ways we work, we have changed the way of working. What do we take forward is really interesting, and that process of adaptation, which is a new world. So thank you very much indeed. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Max. Hi, everyone. Hi from Melbourne, Australia. So we work with a lot of, let's say, dirty hard hat type industries. So we do a lot of work with mining, with oil and gas, with utilities, with construction, with industrial services, lots of hard hats, lots of high visibility clothing. And so we've seen some interesting challenges for different types of organizations in industry sectors. And I just want to talk briefly about this intersection between what has COVID done for market demand for their products and services. So companies that have had a more stable market demand, which has meant more stable revenue and financial resources, have had probably a greater resilient capacity. And what's it done for operational stability? So like Nora was talking about, if there was big transitions to people who are used to working together to being remote or different. And then we've seen what has been the adaptive capacity of that individual organization. So when we've seen what's happened, what it's done to the market, what it's done to the stability of their operation, and what adaptive capacity they've had inherently, we've sort of seen some different outcomes. Interestingly, the commodity-based sectors, so mining and oil and gas, we've seen them actually fare quite resiliently. Oil and gas obviously suffered some demand issues that coincided with COVID around oil price, which really made it a real hard challenge for them through the middle of last year. But the mining industry, and we work with a number of mining organizations, they've proven really, really resilient. And I think it's because they're used to these commodity cycles. They're used to not being operationally stable. They're used to having fluctuations in resources and revenue. So they've got, I think they've got more proactive adaptive capacity and response capacity to maneuver inside those organizations. Where we saw companies that were normally very stable, and aviation I'd probably say is one of those organizations, but manufacturing and industrial services, we've seen them really struggle because their operational changes push them right to their boundary really fast. So even if they still had a market for their product, they struggled to deliver their services. So they were just some things that we were sort of observing in different sectors and different industries, and they were the three big things that I saw. What did it do to the market? What did it do to the stability of their operation? And what was their inherent adaptive capacity to kind of respond? And they're probably some things we can talk about and answer some questions about.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. Interesting you noticed there's a noticeable of stability of the organization and the performance of the particular organization. I find that particularly interesting. That's sort of the system dynamics become quite to the fore, but how do you recognize that? How will we know that? And so what we get from all three speakers, I think, is a feeling that the organizations were tested throughout COVID-19. And then out of that, you come with a view, as Alex says, 2 out of the 3, yeah, ticking the box, we did quite well in terms of resilience performance. Others less so, and in Nora's case, complete scalability of difference, all the pace of the work. But also I found it interesting, Nora, you said the criticality of software systems, that became much to the fore, which changes things. So that's quite a fundamental change. It's a radical change in the scheme of things. Questions? We've got one question here from Dave Woods. So thank you, Dave. I'll read the question. We see it in the chat, but I'll read it anyway. Some software organizations have attributed their ability to adapt to new demands and security risks to their technology. Is this attribution much too narrow? Is the adaptation due to how people adapted, which required taking advantage of some of the tooling? Now, some of that language is quite new to me. So Nora, would you like to begin with that? And it's a loaded question from Dave, perhaps, but
sure. Yeah, no, I was about to say the same. This feels like a loaded question. Yeah, so some organizations have attributed their ability to adapt to new demands to their tooling. Yeah, that attribution is definitely too narrow. I mean, it was a combination of how they were thinking about things. I don't know of software organizations that have kind of attributed their ability to adapt to some of their tooling. I mean, I think of back when I was at Netflix, way before the pandemic, when I was working there. So most of software relies on the cloud and cloud services, and a lot of software organizations rely on Amazon's AWS specifically. And there was a service in AWS that most software organizations use called S3, which is used for storage mechanisms. And S3 was always kind of bragged about in software organizations that it had, so much uptime. I think the CEO of AWS was on stage at one point saying it was, 99.999% up all the time. And then like a couple months later, it went down. And so every software organization in the world went down in some way that was using AWS. Netflix did not go down. And it was very highly regarded. Like if you Google this was probably from 2017, I think. It was very highly regarded that Netflix didn't go down. And they were kind of, painted like, hey, this went really well. But internally, people were scrambling to make sure that it wasn't going down. And I think a lot of it was some of the tooling and some of the preparation that folks had done. But a lot of it was the preparation, was thinking about some of these things a little bit differently. And I think that's how software organizations have adapted to the pandemic too, is thinking about some of these things a little bit differently. I've heard wild and such creative and wonderful stories from organizations that had to deal with this sudden traffic influx, very quickly. Like I heard a story from an organization that, was delivering food. And there was a period of time where everyone was ordering food during the pandemic, where everyone was ordering alcohol during the pandemic. Like all of those sales were going up a lot and people were using apps to use them. And so the organizations that ran those apps and provided those apps were now, all the software engineers were having to deal with that sudden scale. And I think that's what SREs and DevOps professionals are kind of trained to do. However, it was kind of a seemingly overnight thing with no notice. And so if you hear about some of the ways that folks adapted to this, like, honestly, like, monitoring how some of their competitors are dealing with this and other things like that, or monitoring, when folks in the US or other countries might be ordering specific things. I think that's how we've adapted is by thinking about them a little bit differently and kind of by over communicating. The tooling, yes, is helpful for sure, but yeah, of course that attribution is too narrow.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, these lots of questions. I'll perhaps come to the end. Dave's got a question for Alex, and I think that's kind of an interesting question because it goes into an interesting area of what resilience engineering is. So for Alex Bristol, please. As John Osborne, who's a colleague of Dave and Nora's, when a challenge event occurs, it's difficult to assess its potential viability as a crushing event. So Alex, in your experience in the pandemic, is a threat to financial viability of organizations. That's your insight. Do you think building up adaptive capacity needs to be a single program that addresses all organization viability to future challenges, which I think links to Nora's question about its ability to adapt and the inherent way of thinking, the mindset of the DevOps engineers versus other industries. Would you like to comment, Alex?
So for me, the one of the key pieces is understanding in an organization like an air navigation service provider, where you have some certain very clear set procedures, and you have at a business level relatively clear processes as well. Then you get a disruptive event like this coming along. How do you prepare for that, and how do you make sure it happens? There are pieces for me about scenario planning, making sure you've actually thought about them in advance and got some ideas about what happens. It's also about creating the right culture, because the resilience in something like our business is not created by me, the CEO, declaring us to be resilient. It's about the people who are at the front doing all of the right things at the right times to create that resilience. And then probably this is an unusual crisis for an air traffic provider, because it's chronic. Most crises that we're familiar with are much more acute. They revolve around an incident, a collision, for example, a specific occurrence. And what you need under those circumstances is you need everybody to know what it is they should be doing, and generally speaking, knowing that they have the trust of the very senior management that they will be doing the right things, even when they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. And lots of people under those circumstances then do have to scramble. And I think the trick for an air traffic provider is creating the culture and the environment in which people have both the expertise, knowledge, and believe that they have the trust in them to go and do what they think is right, without having the opportunity to go and keep checking and keep asking, because you often don't have that. And then when you have what is a much more chronic crisis like the COVID one, the whole company then coming together. And I have to say that the whole company in Skyguide has become much closer knit community as a function of this, because of course there's one enemy at the moment, and we're trying to overcome that, even if nobody actually knows exactly what it is they have to do today in order to make it better, because most of it's outside our own hands. So again, to come back as a summary, for me, it's about the creation of the environment in which resilience can happen.
Thank you very much indeed. It's interesting you use the word trust and the conditions of possibility that flow from, I think, that very problematic word. So that's an interesting dimension of resilience engineering. So thank you very much indeed for your contributions and the answers to those questions. We're going to move on now to the large part of this particular webinar. And the first webinar came up with, we synthesized some ideas of the messages, the key things that came up from that particular perspective, which was COVID-19 and ATM. This is a slightly different panel now. And the first real area we want to look at is, and I think all three of you actually allude to, there was something different in what your organizations or domains did. So use the DevOps community's language, post-mortem analysis of resilience in different domains. How did you do that? How did you begin to understand or explore the analysis, analyze your particular resilient performance? And what did you then do with that? So Dave, could I ask you to look at the construction industry? Because you made a very interesting statement that because of the market cycle, business cycles, you were naturally there adapting. It's part of your normal way of working.
Look, Smokes, I think there's a hard question. I can talk about my own business as well as that. I mean, consulting business like what Nora does, and we haven't been in an office with anyone for more than 12 months now. We stare at this webcam like 20 hours a day. That's kind of all we do. But we are doing more work than we've ever done for more companies all over the world than we've ever done work with that would never have sought to engage us. So, and pivoting the model, and we'll never, I don't think ever, go back. Like, you'll be forever, the model will be forever changed, and we'll be more adaptive and more agile and scalable than we ever would have been. So I think, to answer a question that Dave Woods has put into the Q&A about, does an organisation need to have regular tangible experience with surprise events? I think it helps. I think it definitely, my personal experience is that it definitely helps. But what we've seen in the clients that we work with is that I think most of them have just been in a real survival mode. So I don't know how much learning and how much future planning has actually been going on or is going on. So in that post-mortem kind of sense, I'm not sure that process has even happened yet for a lot of organizations to even know what they're going to be doing in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or in the future. So I'm not sure I've got a good answer for you, Smoke, sorry.
No, I think that's actually a very good answer, because it is an evolving situation. It's not something, and that perhaps is an unusual thing. I think we use the word chronic, and maybe that's the nature of this particular surprise or challenge event. It's unlike many others, like Alex and that. So thank you. No, that's quite useful. But the fact that people are coming to you implies some direction they're looking for to get help for. So there's a gap in what they have. Nora, would you like to comment on postmortems, and particularly in your field in the last year or so?
Yeah, I actually, I asked a number of folks kind of towards the beginning of the pandemic in their incident analysis if COVID was mentioned at all. I know even though my company helps builds tooling to help people with their incidents, we also have incidents ourselves. And so I remember kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, when all the schools were shut down, a lot of the parents on my team suddenly had to also be full-time teachers, as well as working at the same time. And so we had to adapt in that way. I mean, we were a team of about 4 at that point. We have about 12 folks now. But it definitely impacted us. And so we had to adapt some of our timelines, some of our scheduling. And I know that happened in a lot of different organizations. I mean, I know folks that suddenly kind of had to drive across the country to be with parents during this time that would have otherwise had a really difficult time being by themselves. And we saw people kind of take off work as well, take actually long breaks from work. And so how are the businesses adapting and surviving at that time? And I think as David pointed out, preparing for surprise is huge. That was a lot of why I got into chaos engineering and software, which is, kind of taking a hypothesis about a surprise event and seeing how you might adapt to it under safe but created conditions in your organizations. And so running things like game days or asking certain questions or getting folks in the room that are not used to kind of responding to some of these things, I think is all very helpful. I mean, so the Super Bowl in the US happened, I guess last Sunday now, was it? And that's always a big thing that software organizations prepare for. A lot of them run commercials during that. And so most software organizations will prep with a game day of sorts for that sudden influx of traffic. I worked at a e-commerce organization several years ago, and I was on call on Super Bowl Sunday, but I didn't get notified from marketing team until either the day before or the morning of the Super Bowl that we were doing this. It was like a very surprise thing, right? And so I suddenly had to prepare to be on call at that moment for all that influx of traffic hitting the homepage. Because what do you do when you see a commercial and you don't know the thing? You go to the homepage, right, on your app. So we had to prepare for all of that. So I think software organizations are used to adapting. Are we used to adapting to this? No. I think I saw a lot of folks mention the pandemic and some of the adaptations, but I think software is still very not used to mentioning some of those more social adaptations as well in their post-incident analyses. And so I wish I saw more of it, because it was obviously a factor that contributed to things that would have been good to chat about. But yeah, we certainly chatted about it internally, and I know organizations did. I know of one organization that actually changed their on-call rotation, and they built a tool in their organization to mark all the people on call that were parents, because the parents suddenly, again, had 2 jobs. And so they marked all the people on call that were parents so that they weren't on call during specific times when they really had to provide childcare, because they didn't have babysitters anymore, they didn't have schools anymore. And so I thought that was a really great story. Yeah.
So in some respects, that reflection of it's real time, you're responding to challenges, but actually it's leading to a new way of thinking about how you can make yourself resilient in that very simple way of being able to do that, but knowing who you move. Okay, thank you very much. Alex, ATM seems to have been in a position whereby it does seem to have taken stock of itself and now has its view. What do you think about the post-mortem analysis of resilience in ATM? Was it fast enough? Was it responsive enough? Or do we still have a long way to go?
At its very basics, I'd say we've got a long way to go still, and it's been interesting to observe. There are 2 basic camps of air traffic providers in Europe anyway, and one of those is the one that looks at this and says, we've really got to get forward, get into new technology, move forward, take this as an opportunity, don't waste the crisis, and get into the next sort of generation of air traffic management tools. And there's another camp, possibly larger, which has said, this is far too difficult, shows that everything's wrong, and in fact status quo is the only possible way forward, and they're taking the opportunity to go back and dig trenches. And I'm concerned that in the navigation service provider community, we're in danger of not taking advantage of the crisis in a way that we possibly could have done. And I think, if I kind of look back at what makes a big difference, one of the issues here was recognition of the problem. When you have an incident that occurs, it's pretty obvious that something's happened, and then you've got to deal with it in a crisis mode. When this started happening, it took quite a while before we realized that we were in a proper crisis as well. So that was an interesting piece there about how do you work on the recognition and the definition of when you're in a crisis if it happens really, really gradually. I'd make an analogy to that, to if you get some kind of degradation of your technological software processing capabilities, and it just gets slower and slower, or somebody starts to penetrate and you don't really notice something is going wrong. If it's really slow and creeping like that, at what point do you determine you've got a real problem? That's one of the things to have a look at. In our post-mortem also, we decided that we'd been lucky. Luck is good. You can make some of your own luck, but you also get some luck as well. If this had happened 2 years previously, we would have had no VPN capability inside the company. Remote working would have been a nightmare. As it happened, we were able to provide 5,000 VPN connections, which for a company with 1,500 people working for it is fine, bearing in mind that about 500 of those need to actually be in the towers or in the control centers anyway. So that was good. And I think we were lucky in the way we set up the COVID task force that I mentioned earlier on. The other element that was unexpected, and this links to what Nora was saying, was the piece about the requirements that we then had to stay in touch with the staff in a completely different way, particularly with emotional support as well. So one of the things that we did is I started doing a weekly co-video, because of course we're hilarious like that and called it a COVID circumstances, and try to just make sure that people had a weekly, it's now fortnightly, but a weekly update directly from the CEO that then goes on the intranet site, that everybody's still got some kind of a connection. We also then did town hall meetings 4 times a year virtually, so that people can ask the questions and there's some kind of dialogue. And all the managers were encouraged to make sure they got weekly call-ins with the whole team so that people actually still felt like they were part of a team. That was very unexpected as well. And I think will prove in the fullness of time to have been one of the most important things as and when people can eventually return to work again.
Thank you. I want to pick up a question in the chat from Tom Larson, which is that the preparations are there. You've gone that way, but over a year, organizations have found pressure just to stay afloat, to stay alive almost. Then what does that mean? How do you then adapt when the buffers are changing, the resources you have, the very sources of that adaptive capacity in organization are changing because the financial pressures are so great. So it might start as an incipient change, but now, Alex, you've got a much broader change, which can lead the survival of the company to be threatened.
Absolutely, and put very bluntly, every European ANSB went broke in 2020. We ran out of money. We wouldn't have been able to pay salaries towards the back end of the year if we hadn't got a bailout from the government. Most other ANSPs are in a similar position. Some ANSPs are partly privatized, so they can't be refinanced by a government and have to go and look for capital elsewhere, which is a nightmare under the current circumstances, because who the hell's going to lend it to you? And if they do, what do they expect back? So it's a reflection of the fact that the system is broken, both at a European level and then at an individual business level, if you like, as well. And within that, there's the big question. It's the same question as always. Point one, you've got to cut your costs wherever you can. You've got to make as many savings as you can, because it's ridiculous to just keep spending money at the same rate as though you were earning lots. That's relatively self-evident. But then you come to the really big, nasty, difficult question, which is, do I now cut right back on my investments and stop? Or do I make a bet that, in fact, I'm going to be able to be more resilient in the future if I invest in things now, like virtualization? To take us as an example, we've explained our vision and our strategy to the Swiss government. The Swiss government has said, yes, we buy into that, and therefore we would prefer you to continue to invest, because the future that you're going to deliver with those investments means we won't have to go through another one of these crises again. Unfortunately, not every government sees that the same way. And so there are many ANSPs who are in an existential crisis.
Thank you very much indeed, because is one of the things that emerged last time was this notion of technical resilience versus operational resilience versus financial resilience and business resilience. And that leads then quite nicely to the relationship between the business model and resilient performance organizations. So I think that's perhaps an area that we have learned. It's kickstarted resilience engineering into that direction. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. There is a perennial problem when talking about resilience engineering, but particularly now, and I think we've heard a number of examples of how organizations have adapted by implementing resilience. So the question really for you, and I'd like to start with you, Nora, to get your experience. How do we go about implementing resilience at an organizational level?
Sorry, repeat the last part one more.
How do we go about implementing resilience at the organizational level, be it from a strategy perspective, business continuity, technological enablers, management systems? But there is this notion of resilience engineering, resilient performance. How do we realistically go about implementing that? And what does COVID-19 provide to us as the new enablers or facilitators, if they're there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have a lot of opinions on this topic. I think in software specifically, being aware of things in your organization is, I know it sounds kind of simplistic, but I think there are different ways that software can go about it that hasn't in the past. And so I talked about this notion of game days before, and building off of David's point of preparing for surprises. I think that is a muscle that we can get better at. It's easy to say, okay, we prepare for surprises, but what surprises do we prepare for? Are we taking note of who is responding to things? Are we taking note of the folks that know a particular part of the system that is always falling down, and who's knowing that, and how are we building expertise throughout the rest of our organization? How are we training and onboarding new people? I think one of the things organizationally that changed a lot all over the software industry is I think a lot of folks at the beginning were either, kind of absent from their positions or changed positions in organizations. And now we're reaching a point, I think, where a lot of folks are not changing jobs. But I think preparing to not have kind of so much reliance on single people in the organization is something that software is not used to. I think a lot of software organizations operate under this model of the startup where they have kind of a few engineers at the beginning, and then all of a sudden they scale really rapidly, have to add a bunch of people to the team. But those few engineers from the beginning are still the ones that are keeping the lights on. And everyone else is trying to help where they can, but the organization is not paying too much attention to getting the folks, the newer folks to level up. They're just relying on all these early folks. And I don't think a lot of software organizations realize how much of a problem that is. And so I think being a little bit more self-aware of spreading out and disseminating that expertise and actually investing time in training our staffs and training our engineers is going to be so much, that need is going to be so much bigger than we realize. And I think that is going to be a big part of how we continue adapting to this.
Thank you. Dave, what would, from your perspective, because our organization is going to come to, or will you be offering, if you were to offer an organization a chance of implementing resilience at organizational level, what would you do differently in COVID-19 or post-COVID-19?
Differently, I think, I don't know I'd do anything differently. I think hopefully you'd get a better audience with those organizations now that they've been through such a situation. I think there's a couple of things that I've learned that I think is important. And I really love the way that Nora just said, being aware. So I think what we see in organization is how aligned is all levels of the organization on what the real-time operating context of the organization is. And what's the model of risk around that real-time operating context. So where we see that the CEO knows just as much about what's going on the front line as the people on the front line, I think we get more resilient decisions, more timely decisions made to adapt the organization and provide resources. So that sort of speaks into things like communication, just how open is the communication flows in the organization. I think when I think about my work in the safety profession, and I think even thinking about Nora's work in chaos engineering, and that is, does the organization have actually any dedicated resources that are trying to do this, that are trying to identify sources of brittleness, that are actually trying to build adaptive capacity in the business as their core job? And I think if those roles aren't there, or those roles go, then the organization's adaptive capacity starts to degrade quite rapidly. And I think the last thing we've learned, which is going back to the other question, is about sort of the goal conflict that exists within the system and the organization. So we've been doing a bit of work on with some organizations on just going right back to Rasmussen's model of economic workload and safety margins, and in dynamic organizations, how are those pressures changing the capacity for maneuver of that organization. And particularly now that we're seeing this financial pressure really squeeze the operation, if there's nothing pushing back against that pressure, or there's no way for the organization to absorb that, then I think they're going to really find things really challenging. So I think there's some of the things that I think about with implementing resilience sort of before the crisis, but also after the crisis, to start talking with organizations.
So from a safety professional's perspective, does COVID-19 produce a set of conditions, a possibility whereby you can come up with an organization's narrative and say, this is something to consider? Is there more leverage now from a safety professional's perspective?
Look, I think there's an opportunity for safety and resilience professionals. Absolutely. Like right now, if you're in the middle of the biggest, probably global shock to our communities and our industries, that, like, what is it, a 1 in 100? It might be 1 in a millennia type event, given the globalization of our economies and our global community. So if it's not an opportunity now for people like us to be visible and be vocal, and then I don't think we're going to have any other opportunity like this. But we're also seeing, safety, these professionals just be sidelined where they didn't have a prominent sort of status or power or authority in their business to have a voice, particularly like in the healthcare sector. Safety professionals in the healthcare sector have ironically, I wrote a paper on this, have ironically been really marginalised through COVID as almost irrelevant. So it's been interesting to see the different industries and what the safety profession sort of done in response.
I think for a future panel, it'd be quite interesting to have some healthcare professionals give their view of, but they are otherwise engaged at the moment, I think.
Yeah.
Alex, would you like to comment at all? Have you comment on, because Skyguide has been quite progressive, not just in its notion of resilience engineering, but also the way it's digitizing the operation, and they are quite intention. Any comments you'd like to make on implementing resilience in the light of the last year?
I think I'd just like to sort of reinforce what both Nora and Dave have said. I mean, it's a bit like, when is the best time to go to an executive team and talk about safety and spending more money on safety? It's just after the accident. When is the best time to go and talk to them about resilience? It's about now. You know, as they both said, you know, the awareness is there. And for me, I think it's really it is inevitable that for the next 2 to 3 years, the senior teams, boards of directors and so on, will focus on, have you built resilience into your strategy, yes or no? The risk is that in 10 years' time, people will have kind of forgotten and it'll drift away again. So now's the time to take the opportunity, get it in there, make sure that people do build these things in, and almost build them in so that you can't take them out again. So that it will in fact continue for the generations that weren't necessarily there to experience what we've just experienced as well. And I think the other comment I would make, I aim it at us, but actually it's more generic than that as well, is companies, organizations need to think about resilience differently, but they need not to think about resilience just locally for themselves. To take an ANSP as an example, we can get resilience from our neighbors. We can get resilience from other people in the network. It's not just us that has to become resilient on our own. And that's one of the failings in the system, in the European system, but in the global ATM system as well, is that everybody thinks far too locally and tries to resolve everything locally, instead of thinking, how can I look for resilience with partners, with others, and collaborate for resilience?
Thank you very much. There's a question in the chat, which I think is quite pertinent now, and that is that, it's from Jojo Franca. Maybe say that in the face of the pandemic, countries, organizations had to prove their resilience. That's an interesting notion of proving resilience, of who to and why. And this is a real good example. But how much resilience is present in the daily life of all of our activities? We just have to properly measure it. Now, there's a proposition. Can we actually properly measure means resilience? How do we know how resilient we are? I mean, we talk about brittleness. How do we know that? Where do we begin? I think that was one of the questions that came up and themes that emerged from our last webinar. Any ideas? Nora, measurement of how do you know how resilient an organization is at any one moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stuff happened at once in the pandemic. And as Alex was saying, like, as a company leader, I had to provide a lot of emotional support to my team as well. There was a month-long period where it just seemed like one thing was happening after another, and I kind of asked one of the folks on our team, like, are you okay? And they were like, are you okay? And we kind of had this like honest conversation. It's like, no, actually none of us are okay, but we're doing it. Like, we have nothing else. We have to adapt, right? We have to be resilient right now. And so, like, I think it goes back to this concept of being aware of the things that you're adding on your pile, that you're kind of forced to adapt with and forced to grow with, like as an organization, but also kind of keeping in mind on the individual level. I think everyone's individual lives kind of creeped into work, not only just because of the fact that we're all calling in from our homes right now, like everything's a little bit more apparent. Like, you'll see a toddler jumping on a lap. Like, I was on a call a few days ago, and like, I had a family member that I was living with that had COVID, and I had to go to another area so that I could isolate, and I'm, driving to get to the other area quite quickly so that I can sign on a call. I get to the, the house that I'm, going to sign on the call with, and I get to the call in time, and it's, kind of a serious call. and their kitten jumps on my head during the call. And it's just, it's little things like that I think, like, it sounds silly in theory, but I think it's just being aware and kind of like, we're measuring our ability to kind of adapt to these things, but we're still going, and it's quite phenomenal what organizations and what individuals are doing right now. And I think just calling it out is kind of huge. It allows you to acknowledge its presence, and I think that's been honestly quite helpful in sort of, I don't know if I would say measuring it, but at least being aware of it, so that we're working in structures to adapt to some of those things, whether it's changing kind of the time of your daily meeting, or things like that allow you to adapt, but allow you to kind of keep going. Because as you know, it was talked about earlier, there are new types of financial pressures now, and you know, continuing to be aware of them and understand that you're not operating as normal is really helpful for moving forward.
That seems to be a strong theme that's emerging from this discussion today, is the very individual effects of a pandemic to allow people to work. And so that's perhaps something that, well, out with the resilience engineering discourse at the moment, but there's something there that I think is quite interesting. Dave, do you have any comments about how you measure, how does an organization know how resilient it is?
Yeah, I think I think people are incredibly resilient, and this is an example of that. Generally, in spite of their organizations trying really, really hard not to make them resilient and not to really support them to adapt. But I'm not so interested in measuring resilience, but like Nora said, being aware. But I think it's important to understand it. And so some of the things that we do is, like, we almost do ethnographies inside organizations and use that to actually really discover the pulse of the operation and what's in the minds of the people, and to understand some of these things like leadership, resources, goal conflict and trade-offs, communication, alignment on objective and things like that. And how decision making gets enacted at what levels of the organization. So you can understand a lot about the adaptive capacity of an organization without counting anything and measuring anything. So I don't know. I'm no longer really in search of a measurement for it.
Thank you. I think it's a very useful contribution, because why do we have to measure it is a very good question. Put aside what we measure, why do we need to? Alex, from your perspective, do you need to measure resilience in Skyguide or in ASB?
I think as the leadership team, we would very much like to be able to measure resilience. Yes. Do I believe it's possible? That's a different question. And maybe just take one step back as well, and just build on what both Dave and Nora said, because Joshua was also sort of saying, aren't we actually in our daily lives very, very resilient? And I think we are. The human being can do that. Whether a collection of human beings then in an organization always works as resiliently as an individual is a different matter, because they may not be pulling in the same direction or trying to achieve the same things. But equally, some people, it seems to me, make sure that they create a probability of resilience that's greater than some others. I mean, I just take the example of myself and my wife. I can hear in the background during the last few minutes that she's left to go and pick up our son, and I'm thinking that's cutting it a bit fine. And if it snows a bit later on, she hasn't left herself enough time to be particularly resilient. I would have gone 10 minutes earlier, and I would have probably been sat there doing emails or whatever on my iPhone for 10 minutes. But there's a piece there as well about you building your own resilience around yourselves, and some people build more in than other people, just, if you like, by their very nature. Sorry, a quick excursion and back now. I make an analogy to some extent between resilience and how one might look for resilience in an organization, and the way I approach the topic of safety culture as well. in safety culture, there's nothing I can go and measure. I can't point at something and says if I've got 10 of those, it's a good safety culture. If I haven't, I've got none. But there are signals, there are markers, and that's what Dave was alluding to as well. There are certain things that you can go and have a look at and see, and you say, yeah, that's probably quite a good sign, or that's maybe not quite such a good sign. So there may be the possibility of some kind of a maturity model, I think, where you then say, well, yeah, if you've got some of this and some of this and some of this, you're doing okay. But if you've got this, 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 and this, if, for example, everybody's really clear what the task is, they're all aligned in each area about what their main task is. They also know what the rules are and what the limits are, where they can go to in the event of something going wrong. It's some of the simple stuff, of course, is in our very specific instance is does the ANSP have any kind of an agreement, anything in its strategy with the government, with the regulator, with the airspace users, as to how much downtime is acceptable to them? Because if you've got that, then you can start building some resilience around the outside of that. So for me, there are some signals and some markers that you could maybe have a look at and think about, maybe creating some form of a maturity index out of it, which at least gives you a little bit of structure. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that the best way that I can determine whether I think our company's got some resilience or not is to go and talk to people and ask some of the right questions. But very often, of course, you don't know what the right question should have been until it was in the past.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Very useful discussion. Nora.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on top of that too. I think a lot of organizations get in this mindset of like, okay, we're going down. Things are not great right now. Let's slap some measurements on it without actually taking the time, as Alex said, to ask questions and talk about it, right? And so they are trying to make measurements before actually taking the time to deeply understand it without that, that framework in place, right? Which is really, ends up being detrimental, as we all know. And one of the things our organization has been doing lately is when it's not an incident, but it's a surprise, like we just having little surprise situations, we've been doing post like surprise reviews. And so I think it allows for that discussion, then that question asking in kind of a non-emotionally charged way. And we're building that muscle, doing more and more of those. We're trying to do them weekly now because there's surprises every week, right? And I think that is helping us at least not get in this trap of like, oh, we need a bunch of measurements attached to this.
Oh, that's quite interesting, because the notion of a surprise event in those terms, I think it makes it much easier to access people's experience of work, because just asking, say, well, tell me what success you had this week. It's very difficult for people to actually verbalize or even think in those terms. So that's kind of interesting. We have, I've got a question, Dave, I'm going to put to you first, because it's coming from Australia. Paulo Gomes, who works in you may know Paulo. And the question is, how do they believe we can balance efficiency versus resilience moving forward? We need to have an adaptive capacity, but we also want to grow and expand without compromising safety. So it's like shifting the focus of the webinar now. What strategies shall we consider then to balance versus resilience? Dave.
Yeah, good question. G'day, Paulo. I don't know why you're still not sleeping at this time of night. But anyway, look, I think it is the very adaptive capacity that we need to grow and expand without compromising safety. So we have to have that. How are we going to balance efficiency and resilience going forward? Hopefully a little bit better than we have in the past, because of maybe the learning that I hope will go on through and post COVID. But I think that's really the role for us and the professionals inside organisations, like Alex said, to have the ear of their organisation and say, how are we not going to find ourselves in the situation that we found ourselves in this time? And what do we need to build? What capacity do we need to build around our core operation, or whether it's our technology or our finances or some of those other things? What do we need to build around that to position us better for what might happen in the future, not knowing what that might be? So hopefully, Paolo, we ourselves can get in front of our organisations and try to create some strategies that are specific to the organisation, specific to the operations, and the finances and the technology that can make us more adaptive than we would have been before the pandemic.
So it goes back to very much what we're saying about listen to people, go out and explore, and then build on that. So you have very much user-driven or practitioner-driven solutions or solutions to strategies you can develop. So it's more targeted. Okay, Nora, what do you think? Balancing efficiency versus resilience moving forward.
Yeah, efficiency versus resilience. So we need an adaptive capacity, but we want to grow and expand without compromising safety. I think, yeah, I mean, so in my organization right now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the pandemic, we're 4 people and now we're 12, which is effectively, you know, we tripled our size, even though it is still a small amount. And, you know, as a leader, on one hand, we're growing a lot, and like some of the demands are growing faster than we kind of expected. And so I'm trying to balance like not just putting a bunch of people on the team versus like actually being aware of how it's impacting the team, because what's ending up happening with just this particular example and on adding people and changing the team dynamics is, even with one additional person, it is a shiny new team that we now have to adapt and learn and form and storm together. And so I'm trying to move a little bit slowly there in order for us to go fast, because I've been on the opposite side of the spectrum where an organization's tool is growing really fast and they hire like 60 people at once. I remember I was in an organization once and I was the 60th engineer, and 4 weeks later, there were 120 engineers on the team, and we were just kind of all running around trying to figure out where we were supposed to help out. And I never want to end up in a situation like that, because I think it's easy, you know, from a high level perspective to say, oh, you know, more people will move faster, but we know that that's actually not the case, right? And so again, I think it goes back to being hyper aware of how it's affecting the team and having those real honest conversations on a regular cadence that allow us to kind of ask each other questions about how things are going, how projects are going, how things got released, what went as expected and what didn't go as expected. I think helps us continue to balance that efficiency versus resiliency trade-off. But I mean, we experience it all the time. We're building a tool on my team, and all of us come from reliability engineering backgrounds. And so we think all the time about the resilience, but we also have to move fast. We have to prove that what we're building is something that is needed. And so we had to balance that ourselves, which was kind of against our nature a lot of the time. And so I think it's just being hyper aware of the trade-offs with each part of the system that you're making. Like, is this something that's going to help us now or really hurt us in the future?
Thank you very much indeed. So thank you for that. Interesting discussion, lots to think about and to assimilate and take in. We want to finish the session, the webinar, in the last 10 minutes or so, with this subject that constantly seems to be there in the resilience engineering discourse, which is bridging the gap between theory and practice. How do we do it? What would you like to share your view on how we take this theoretical position and go forward in some way to effectively employ it, to use it, to incorporate it into our organizations? And Alex, we talked about this on Tuesday. So you have experience of this. How do you think we can bridge that gap?
I think this question or this theme makes quite a nice sort of wrap up, because it brings in a lot of strands of the various things that we've been talking about actually over the last hour and a bit. The fact that the awareness is there at the moment is already a big bridge, because to a lot of people it's either an additional investment which people don't want to make, can't afford to make, whatever, or if I have to invest in this, I have to lose something else. And it is the perfect moment, of course, for people to understand the importance of this, because it is not the last time that something is going to happen. And if you're not resilient, the only companies that will survive over a longer period are surely going to be the ones that are. And it seems to me that certainly I'm now just focusing on ourselves in Skyguide very selfishly, but if we have got the capability of bringing together the future direction that we need to take, in other words, our strategy sits there and it has got some resilience built into it, then we've got the best and the perfect things of all worlds. Specifically, the way that we will be able to make ourselves more efficient going into the future is to try and do a lot less ourselves, to get people in who are experts in doing all sorts of software things and buy them in as a service instead of having a big box in our cellar to do it ourselves, and to look at the right partners to help us build a resilient system. In other words, I don't want to necessarily be able to provide all of the resilience within Skyguide myself, because otherwise I'm going to build up essentially two lots of the same thing. We've got to take a leap of faith for the regulators and some of the government authorities and use this terrifying thing called the cloud. Apparently other people use it, I've heard, but it's there is no reason why not to, but it still takes quite a mindset shift for a lot of people who are in the industry that we're in to understand that that's a way forward into the future, and it brings with it both efficiency and resilience. I think if we can try and shift the conversation from being the polarity of it's either this or it's this, and find some way that and in the middle, then we've got it cracked.
Thank you very much. Yeah. The regulator's there in the background. Nora, could you how do you bridge theory and practice? Because you are doing it.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that. I mean, I think the theory has taken hold of a small number of people in the software industry, and there's a large number of people in the software industry that are aware of it and skeptical. I think it can be thought of as a little bit polarizing for some folks in the software industry, and it's almost like thought of as a you're doing it wrong perspective. And so what myself and we at Jelly are trying to do is take more of a change management approach with it, and that not know you're doing it wrong, just hey, you're doing great, yes, and we're going to add on top of that, right? We're going to, and so I think that approach of not kind of ripping people from what they're doing, because they have worked hard on it, they just haven't been thinking of it under this different lens, I think has actually proven to be really helpful so far in shifting some of the hearts and minds. So I think bridging that theory and that practice, we really do need a kind of a change management approach where it's a little bit kind of over time. I mean, one of my favorite stories is there's this design book about, I think it was in the 90s or something, there was a login button on a website, and designers had researched and stuff and said, oh, we had the wrong color for the login button. It's supposed to be it was orange and it's supposed to be blue, right? And so designers were like, oh, we've done all this research, it's really supposed to be blue. It's just better if it's blue. And so they switched the color, and then the next day, all these customers called in and complained because they couldn't find the button. And so they're all upset that they couldn't find the button. And so what they did was they rolled back the change and they changed it a pixel a day until it got to the new color, and then no one was complaining anymore. Right? And so I think of it like that. It's changing it a pixel a day,
A pixel a day. Okay, that one is very worthwhile. Thank you very much. Dave, your comments on bridging theory and practice, because I think, again, you're also in this area where you're working both.
Yeah, very quickly. I think it's maybe bridging practice to theory now, because we've got this massive global case study of resilience right now. I mean, if you had have asked me 18 months ago, it described the situation that we'd be in and say maybe only 10% of global people would lose their job, and I'd run a business for 12 months not being able to leave my study or something and grow. And I wouldn't have thought that adaptive capacity existed. And so I think now with the thing that we've got to do, and we've done a few things at Griffith University to try and track data longitudinally through the global case study that's playing out with safety professionals, with organizations. And I think now what we've really got to do is, as practitioners and researchers, is actually look at what's going on in the world and test what we're seeing with what our theories tell us we should be seeing, and expand our theory and reinforce our theories, and then use that to go back and explain to practitioners how they were able to be resilient. So they did it, but they may not actually know how they did it. And so that's this loop that I'm seeing an amazing opportunity for us now over the next 3 to 5 years, to not waste the case study, to not waste all the data that's out there at the moment.
There's a lot of data out there now, so let's grab it and see what we can do with it. But I like the idea of reversing it. Yeah, it's how practice informs theory. That could be very, very successful, I think. We've reached the time. It's my clock up there says it's 2:15, 3:15. So thank you very much indeed, Nora, Alex, and Dave. I know, Nora, I've seen dawn rise in your window behind you, so it's rather. Thank you, Dave. I know how. Thank you very much indeed for joining us in the middle of the night. Alex, thank you very much indeed for a very enjoyable session, a lot to think about. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope those who are still here in the webinar have enjoyed the session. We will have recorded it, we'll be posting a recording at some point. We'll also have a webinar report, and we may well be back with some themes in another webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Right, bye now.
Thanks, bye now.
Thanks, Dave.
That's okay. Good.
Sorry, threw you your curveball.
No, not at all. Thanks for that. I didn't know what the protocol was, whether we were hanging around or not, but I'll let you go if you like.
Yeah, we can go back to bed now. It's funny, but Paulo's always up, isn't he? He comes to our sessions at 4 European, and there he is. And there was an occasion when he was recording snoring.
Oh, really? No, it's funny now that the time zones don't really mean much for the last year or so. It's been
no, not at all. No,
they don't really mean too much.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
I'll get back to you on email. It'd be good to have a chat soon.
Yes, please. Yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. Yeah.
That'd be good. I'll drop you a note.
Good, look to it. Thanks, Dave. Say hello to Drew.
Yeah, I will. See you, mate.
Bye. Hi, Milana.
Yeah. Hello. It went really well. I was really pleased, huh?
You sure?
Yeah, very, very much so.
I can't see you.
It's a shame we could. Sorry, it's a shame we could not continue with this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
I was a bit disappointed. I couldn't get into some of the detail I wanted to get into.
It's too short. Yeah. It's hard, but
and I think particularly with Dave, I think there's lots of stuff we could have got into, but we didn't. But sadly, yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of material, but I think Alex was super concrete, and yeah. Shall we stop this webinar now?
It should be. Just need to stop the recording.
Yeah.
A couple of people.